on behalf of the Australia Institute, I want to welcome you here. And of course, the Australia Institute is the hardest working, best, most progressive think tank in Australia. We back great ideas, not political parties. And my name's Alex Sloan, and I'd like to acknowledge we're on Ngunnawal Ngambri land, and country that was used to by the Narragain and Wiradjuri people, land that was never ceded. And I personally have only ever been treated with kindness, wisdom, generosity, patience, and in many cases a warm sense of humour by this country's First Peoples, and I want to thank them for their custodianship of this land, and hope that we can soon vote in a referendum for a constitutional voice to Parliament, as requested by the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which was just affirmed this weekend by leading representatives of First Peoples at an historic meeting in Cairns and Yarrabah. History is calling, it's time. So it is very great to be sitting alongside a partner in crime over many years, the marvellous Dr. Richard Dennis. He's the Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, and I know full well that to engage with Richard is a wild ride. And to pinch a line actually from my daughter who's here tonight, it's like the rearranging of the furniture in your head, and at the end of that ride, your vision will be clearer and you'll want answers about why we do the things we do and why we prioritise some things over others. And Richard's contribution, this latest one, is in the great series called In the National Interest, commissioned by Louise Adler at Monash University Publishing. And his contribution is to go big, to talk about big, the role of the state in the modern economy. Please welcome Dr. Richard Dennis.
Thanks, Alex.
Richard, I always love trying to keep up with you. So I've got a quick quiz.
I don't know what the wage price index was last quarter.
But how many houses will be lost due to climate change in this country, and what is the current rate of species extinction in Australia?
Well, according to the federal government's own advice, we're looking at losing 100,000 homes. 100,000 homes in Australia in the coming decades. And as for the rate of species loss, I don't know, except to say I know it's amongst the highest in the world.
And
how'd I go?
You did really well. We texted you the answers before. They're all provided in Richard's book. But yeah, what have you made of this? Adam Bant doubled down at the press club today with the media to say, just Google it.
Fantastic. Has everybody seen it? Yeah, look, it's great. It's fun to watch and it's important to watch. And for those that didn't, Adam Bant was asked what the wage price index was today, and his answer was Google it. But then he launched into, I thought, quite an impressive 2-minute tirade about how important elections are, how the contest of ideas is so important, and how, now that's literally what he said. Now I'll put words in his mouth, but this was the sentiment he was making, that elections are these really important things where we face big choices, and it's only every couple of years that we get to decide who our delegates are in our parliament to make decisions on our behalf. And to think that the key criteria for doing that is knowledge of a particular statistic is dangerous, let alone absurd. So no, really, it's a great 2-minute YouTube clip. I encourage you to watch it, but yeah, the sentiment is as important as the delivery was good.
It says as much. I think the media has thrown itself in there as a sort of a major part of the narrative this week. There's a fury about the media.
It's worse than that. The media is the narrative. Like, let's be crystal clear. Who else tells us what the narrative is other than the media storytellers? Now, when you have diverse media ownership, maybe somewhere in the diversity of all that media commentary comes a common thread. But Australia has one of the most concentrated media markets in the world, so what could be more alarming? Even if you didn't have a problem with the ownership structure of that, just to have 2 media outlets that dominate so much news in Australia, describing what's happening between 2 political parties, no wonder the debate is narrow and divisive and leaves most people cold, because the lack of diversity within the media combined with the lack of diversity within our parliament creates this tiny little avenue that we're allowed, and that's the whole point of the essay, we're just not allowed to talk about things that sort of don't conform to the norms of the parties and the two major parties and the two major media proponents.
And I'll just throw in there, I read the real anger with the media, the frustration with the ABC, but actually the Australia Institute put out a report in February this year to just point out the ABC has had $500 million worth of cuts in the last 8 years and has lost 600 jobs. I mean, it's really something to take on board. $500 million and loss of 600, in many cases, quite senior journalists.
Oh, absolutely. And look, if everyone's not angry at the ABC at some point, they're not doing their job. No, I mean that. Like, if you agreed with everything they said, not just in terms of their selection of stories, but their analysis of those stories, something would be wrong. So anger at the ABC isn't a problem. Anger at any news outlet is not a problem. But, to put that into context, the annual budget of the ABC is about $1 billion a year. And that's everything. That's news collection in regional Australia and overseas. That's producing and putting the Wiggles to air. It's ABC Classic Radio. $1 billion a year to do all of the collection, all of the content creation and all of the distribution. The big four banks spend that on advertising. Okay, the ads of the big four banks cost as much as the entire national broadcaster. Now, what do the big four banks do with $1 billion worth of ads? They don't even provide information. Right? They're the most expensive banking products you can buy. Right? Here's a tip: if anyone here is banking with the big four, you're paying too much. The only purpose of the ads is to make you feel comfortable with them and skeptical of the bank you haven't heard much about. So you might as well stick with the one that you keep seeing all the time. So all that expenditure on advertising is just tricking you into spending too much on their products, making you afraid of the thing you don't know so well, which is the perfect analogy for apparently what's wrong with Anthony Albanese. We've ignored him, he's been in Parliament longer than Scott Morrison. He was a cabinet minister before Scott Morrison was in Parliament, and the mainstream media are the ones that didn't sort of say much about him are now saying that you don't even know who he is.
But it's a Scott Morrison talking point.
Well, exactly. But how does the media, the organisations that could have spent the last 3 years telling you everything you wanted to know about Anthony Albanese, how do they then turn around and say the problem with him is you don't know anything about him? They're the ones that made that decision. They could have put a profile piece on him every month for the last 3 years. They didn't do that, and now his problem is you don't know him.
So I was just settling a few things that have gone on this week, but I do want to get back to this fine essay. And I also...
She knows how to plug a book, doesn't she, people?
It's a beautiful little essay, and as I always say, as a non-drinker, I don't take bottles of wine. I take great products like this and Alan Beam's book to the next dinner party. So buy yourself at least 10 copies before you walk out the door. Look at the opening pages. You've given us a great tip. Never go out to dinner with someone who thinks you should order the cheapest wine or have the smallest public sector possible.
Yep. Good advice, especially in a town like Canberra.
When did public service and public servants, when did they become pejorative terms and the root of all evil?
Yeah, look, I can't date it precisely, but it's certainly not new. And in Australia, I think it's safe to say from the mid-1990s onwards, Labor and Liberal state and federal have kind of told a story that the smaller the public sector, the more efficient the economy will be. The less money the government spends, the better off we will be. That literally a causal link between reducing the size of the public sector and expanding the size of the private sector. Reducing expenditure on health and education and welfare equals increasing your incomes so that you can spend more money on your stuff. So for 30 years, again, state and federal, Labor and Liberal, that narrative has been pretty common that says the less we spend on something, the better it will be. Now that's possible. There are products where the less you spend on them, the better. I shop around for petrol. I don't think, I saw that great ad for Ampol the other day, and it really made me think, like, that's the petrol for me. But think about it, what the hell are they advertising petrol for? Now, I know ads don't work on you, but the person sitting next to you I'm a bit worried about. Because Ampol spends hundreds of millions of dollars putting ads on telly saying, why not buy your petrol from me? Does anyone have a brand preference for petrol? So please, shop around when it comes to petrol. But when it comes to wine, it's not at all obvious that the cheapest wine is a bargain. When it comes to food, it's not at all obvious that the cheapest food is the best food for you to buy. When it comes to clothes, when it comes to your car, I put it to you that most people in this room did not spend as little as they possibly could on lunch today. And that's fine. We don't think it's wasteful to spend more than you have to on lunch. We don't think it's wasteful to spend more than you have to on your car. But if you want to spend more than we have to on health, what are you, crazy? You want to spend more than the bare minimum on your kids' education? What kind of freak are you? Except if you want to send your kids to a private school, in which case it's a great choice. So, yeah, the idea that the less we spend on valuable services, the better off the economy will be, let's just be careful here, has nothing to do with economics. That is just absolutely unrelated to anything found in an economics textbook.
Because you say the Nordic countries remain the policy examples whose names we dare not speak.
Yes.
It's an unfortunate, inconvenient example.
I've literally been on radio interviews where people have, asked me, well, can you really think that spending more money, on services would be good for the economy? And I say, well, yeah, let's talk about Norway and Denmark and Sweden. And they say, well, but can you do it without using those examples? I'm not making this up. Sure, you've got compelling evidence of your point, but if you don't use the compelling evidence, can you still make your point? And of course the answer is yes, because I just did. We don't buy the cheapest food and wine possible, most of us. We understand that sometimes there is more quality that comes with a higher price. This is not radical stuff. And to suggest that's not the case for some of our services is absurd. But in Australia, it's been the dominant discourse for decades.
You say the obsession with the incessant propaganda war against the efficiencies and effectiveness of government services, along with the demand to shrink the size and role of government, is really helping to drive a loss of faith in democracy. That's where we're at.
Well, guess what? We've spent 30 years saying, basically making the term government synonymous with waste and inefficiency. Talking about public sector as a pejorative and free markets and private sector as good. The people that we actually elect to represent us, to spend our money on our services on our behalf, they themselves have spent decades basically saying, the private sector's great and the public sector's wasteful and inefficient. Guess what we've done, having criticised actually the machinery of government for decades? We've grown a generation of people that think government isn't any good at anything. And you can't really blame young people who've only ever heard that government is wasteful and inefficient and all the parties are the same and it doesn't matter who you vote for because we should privatise everything. Guess what? When you survey them, they don't think democracy's that flash. Because what's actually the point of having a democracy if you don't think that the government you elect can make a difference in your life? What's actually the point of having a democracy and having a fight about health policy or education policy if you don't actually believe that the decisions governments make might improve your life?
Because, and you give some great examples in this book, you say government policies and spending haven't just improved our lives, they've saved them as well.
Well, absolutely, and I think that's why, I'm an optimist, so I always hope we're at a bloody turning point. 50 years old, I'm waiting. Wait any day now. But yeah, look, for what we've just seen through COVID was the minute that COVID hit, we had a very conservative federal government who never for a minute, even though I questioned some of the decisions they made, they didn't once say, pandemic, health crisis. Yeah, the market will fix that. No, this is important. Like a problem hit, a real proper problem. Like not a bullshit made up culture war problem, like a problem. And no one thought, yeah, let's leave it to the market. No one thought that. And then So in terms of policy response, the government, allegedly small L, conservative government that wanted to get off everybody's back and let everyone get on with their own life, and all the metaphors and analogies of sort of small government, and there they were closing borders, mandating things, regulating things. Why? Because it works. Because we needed it. And then, of course, when it came to fiscal policy, the government that was literally elected in 2013 on the back of an alleged concern with a budget emergency dropped a lazy $200 billion into the economy. And guess what? Keynesian stimulus works. No, but we now talk about it as if it's some sort of irony. Australia got through the crisis without the high unemployment everyone expected. You know why everyone expected high unemployment? Because no one expected Keynesian stimulus. All of the forecasts for 10 to 15% unemployment were based on having a conservative government that thought, well, I'm not going to run a budget deficit. The only reason unemployment is at record lows is because everything progressive economists have been saying for 50 years was right. Humble, aren't I? But that's why. We have record low unemployment. Tick. Is that good? Yes. How did we get it? $200 billion worth of stimulus. It worked. So whether it was...
And saved lives.
Saved
jobs and lives.
All of it, whether it was masks, whether it was vaccines, whether it was border controls, whether it was bailing out airports and bailing out airlines and bailing out Harvey Norman, and
Louis Vuitton.
And Louis Vuitton, who strangely have been silent about the role of small government in recent years. All of it worked. The state worked. Public policy worked. Regulation worked. Government spending worked. And now here we all are, kind of, not in this room perhaps, but nationwide, sort of staring awkwardly at each other, trying to figure out how we move forward and pretend that nothing important just happened.
But you point to the tradition of this with Prime Ministers from Menzies, Whitlam, Fraser and Hawke. They all put in place programs that...
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
From
Medicare to...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, historically, whether it was... Menzies did an enormous amount to help people buy and build their own homes, including a lot of public housing, enormous amounts. Fraser created all sorts of lasting and important government infrastructure, including things like human rights commissions and information commissions, all sorts of good stuff. And obviously there's plenty of good stuff from the Hawke and Keating years. So what's the big thing that Scott Morrison's left us with? No, but serious question. What's the thing? Didn't actually do anything. Don't get me wrong, happy with spending $200 billion, but did he spend it on things that would deliver lasting benefits for most of us? No. You might have heard me say this before, but when we got through, we got out of the Great Depression thanks to fiscal stimulus, and a lot of that fiscal stimulus was spent on stuff like all of the beautiful ocean baths up our east coast. And here we are nearly 100 years later still swimming in them. Well, what was it that we just built that you think in 100 years' time people will still be using? So sure, the stimulus was effective, but was it well targeted? No. Was it aimed at things that would deliver lasting benefits? No. Think about all the crap that Rudd got for his school halls. Guess what every one of your kids has been using for the last decade? Right? So how we spend the money really matters. But we haven't had that conversation at all.
Yeah, so how do we get here? I mean, you think most Australians will happily pay more tax than have to worry about paying private health insurance. How did we get to this, we don't need government to help with infrastructure, we pay less tax? How did we get here?
Well, because smart people spent decades getting what they wanted. We didn't get there by accident. And let's be clear, most other countries haven't gone there. Australia's now got more kids in private school than almost any other country in the world. More kids go to private school in Australia than the US. Communists like Boris Johnson oversee a far more socialist health system than we do in Australia. Sure, we've still got Medicare, but we've gutted the thing. Right? And you know that you need your Medicare card, but you know you need your credit card as well. Well, there's the point. The point of Medicare was that you didn't need your credit card to get it. Now we've just created all of this kind of bureaucratic complexity and cost. And don't get me wrong, having Medicare is better than not having Medicare, but plenty of other countries have got much better public health systems than us, including pinko lefties like Boris Johnson.
And you mentioned housing.
See, and he wasn't from a Norwegian, he wasn't even Scandinavian. Right? So you're not allowed to mention the Scandinavians, that's cheating, right? But there are others.
But housing, I just had a friend drop in who's an artist who's having to leave the country because there's just no way that he, A, can get proper paid employment as an artist and get into the housing market. We're going to have generations of people not being able to get into the housing market.
No, we're not. No, we're going to have generations that have a larger and larger percentage of people that can't get into the housing market because old people will die and they won't take their houses with them. And no, this is really important.
Yeah.
It's not young versus old. This is just rich versus poor. And it's actually a trap to fall into the generational idea that only old people will own houses and they'll live forever in their houses. No, they'll die and leave it to some kids and other kids won't. Right? So we're really creating dynastic wealth as the only way to get into the housing market. And that's far worse than old versus young. So let's be clear about this. We know in Australia today that if you or your kids go into aged care or childcare, they've just chosen to never buy a house in a capital city. Right? Let's be really clear. You want to buy a house, you better go into banking, you better go into medicine, you might even go into the public service. But if you're nice enough, kind enough, generous enough, caring enough to go into childcare, no house for you. Right? Unless mum or dad or grandma or granddad gives you one. That's what we've done. And we need to look ourselves in the eye and think, is that really the society that Menzies set out to build? Because it's not. And is it the one we really want to live in? Because it's not. But it's the one we've built.
And you give the great example that on one hand you have people on perks. So some people have two houses. So if you're Prime Minister of this country, you get
Who lives in public housing.
two houses.
No, this is important. There's no shame in his public housing.
Yeah. And then it's the shame file on the others who might be in public housing.
Yep.
Again, how did we get here? And how could we change that? You point out in defence,
Yep.
there is defence housing. Why not for teachers?
Yep.
Why not for nurses? Why not for aged care and childcare workers?
Well, because we're getting to the heart of it, because we didn't want to. Right? And that's the brutal truth of it all, is we actually spend, well, in this year's budget, the government, the appropriations bills spell out everything they've appropriated money for. $630 billion worth. $630,000 million worth of spending for the next 12 months. People tell me budgets are boring. Right? How are you going to spend $630 billion? Who cares? Budgets are boring. What we get in the budget is literally a list of everyone who we like, and if you're not on the list, guess what? We don't like you. But politicians don't get elected by admitting they have clear priorities spelled out annually in a document that anyone can read. We say that tackling Indigenous disadvantage is a priority. We say that helping women fleeing domestic violence is a priority. We say that helping young people get a house is a priority. Did you give them any money? No. Why not? Can't afford it. What are the stage 3 tax cuts going to cost? $15 billion. How can you afford them? They're a priority. The budget literally spells out the priorities. It's not top secret, it's not rhetorical, it's literal. And you can put a number next to it. So how come we have an agency with a top secret name called the Defence Housing Authority. Defence Housing Authority. And it's a public housing authority for people who work in defence. And we give public housing to people who work in defence at low cost, subsidised rent, because we want to. And we don't make them feel ashamed of that, because we don't want to make them feel ashamed of that. And nothing is stopping us having the Health Housing Authority, or the Education Housing Authority, or here's the real kicker, the Housing Authority, where we just built effing houses and rented them to people at low cost, that we wanted to. But we don't. We've stratified, and this is neoliberalism.
You're going to lower the cost of housing, the price of housing, aren't you, Richard? You're going to cause trouble, aren't you?
Well,
People's houses will
but
go down in value.
Yeah, but see, I'm more cynical than that. Always. It wouldn't be as much political fun. It's more fun and much more effective way to win votes by saying to us that we've worked hard and built our own houses and they haven't. We need a them. Right? We have to have a them. So we've stigmatised public housing and we've provided so little of it that there's like a death match between people that need it to fight for who needs it the most, so that we can completely stigmatise who's in there. You know, old mother with substance addiction, living alone and mental health. Oh, well, yeah, you probably do deserve public housing. Oh, you're an aged care worker who'd like to live near their work. Who the hell do you think you are? Right, so we've stigmatised public housing so much that no one really thinks it could be a solution to the problem. When, of course, you know, Europe exists, not just Scandinavia, and other countries have an entirely different approach, and a pinko communist lefty called Robert Menzies had a radically different approach.
Yeah. You said we used to have nice things by Menzies and his successors, but since Howard we've had gruel.
Well, and we literally serve gruel to people in aged care now. Some of the photos that you see of it's just horrible. Like, it just imagine that's your parents literally getting served gruel on white bread for dinner. Australia is one of the richest countries in the world. We just spent 630, or just outlined how we're going to spend $630 billion. We had a royal commission into aged care that told us what the problems were. One of the problems was that we strapped people to chairs for hours. We strapped people to chairs for hours because there's not enough nurses or carers there to look after them. One of the things the Royal Commission said we should do is not strap people to chairs for hours. Don't laugh. What we did instead was change the laws so that you can't get prosecuted for strapping people to chairs for hours. This is what one of the richest countries in the world is doing, and we can afford $15 billion a year in stage 3 tax cuts, and we can't afford to not strap old people to chairs.
We also put $10 billion...
It's good fun, isn't it? Should read the essay.
Sobering moment, but it's the things that gets us up in the morning and yelling at the television. Australia puts $10 billion a year subsidies to the fossil fuel industry.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It's 11.
Yeah, when I was reading this, I thought, I'll just take your figures.
It was fresh when I wrote 10,
okay.
and the Australia Institute's
so
always putting out new research.
What if we put that 11 billion into aged care?
Well, we had much better aged care and much less fossil fuels. No, but that's as simple as that, right? That's what economics tells you. When you spend more money on things, you get more of them. When you subsidise things, you get more of them. And when you subsidise things you want less of, like fossil fuels, it's proof you don't want less of them. Saying you want to transition away from fossil fuels while spending $11 billion subsidising fossil fuels is why you need to read budget papers carefully. Because the government's priority is not a transition to net zero, it's $11 billion worth of subsidies to cause climate change.
And you put aged care to the market, but not the fossil fuel industry.
Exactly.
I always wait for that question.
That was Alex's line. That's not in the book. I should have used it. And look, you know, to pump my own back catalogue, that's what my essay Dead Right was all about. You know, these people are not neoliberal. They are not small government. They are not free market. They subsidise their friends like crazy, and they put market pressures on people they don't like. So, you know, and it's so I mean this. It's both intellectually true and I think important politically from a strategy point of view. It's unhelpful to call these people free market ideologues. That flatters them unfairly. It suggests that there's some rigour behind their thinking when all they're doing is subsidising their friends and punching their enemies. Right, we're about to drop $5.4 billion on the Hell's Gate Dam in North Queensland. No cost-benefit analysis, no business case. But here's the real kicker. The idea's been around for 80 years. Josh Frydenberg's the first treasurer to go along with it. Like, that's how weak the Liberals are now compared to the National Party. The Nats have been pumping for this project for 80 years. And for 80 years, successive governments, state and federal, Labor and Liberal, have said no. Josh Frydenberg says, sure, 5.4 billion, no worries. Why not spend other people's money to buy Barnaby Joyce's silence when we mouth the platitudes of net zero? They're not even hiding it. But it's not their money, they don't care.
George Christensen's done very well today as well.
I hope he gets back in the singlet and pulls the crop out again.
No, but he's just going to get 100 grand, isn't he? Because he's number 3 on the ticket. He can't be elected, so he gets 100,000.
Yeah, and
it's so cynical.
Yeah, it's as if you'd be flattering them to call them small government libertarians.
So you say that neoliberalism has reshaped the public sector. Brackets I've got, if you're going to tell a lie, tell a big one.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely it has. I mean, so I call it the policy deathmatch. What neoliberalism has done, and I mean neoliberalism in its rhetorical sense, because, as I said, they don't mean it. They'll shovel public money onto their friends, and they don't like deregulation. They love regulating unions. They love regulating charities. They love regulating anyone they don't like, and just deregulate the banks and deregulate the aged care providers. So, yeah, I think we need to be we really need to see sort of what's going on here. What they've done with neoliberalism is say, so some people in this room want more money spent on health. Isn't that nice? And some people in this room want more money spent on education. Isn't that nice? And some people want more money spent on climate change. So why don't you guys fight it out? You fight it out. You figure out what the priority should be, because there's not much money, and I've only got enough money to make one of you happy. So all of these kind of progressive constituencies have been aimed at each other, trying to make a bizarre case that investing in health gets more bang for the buck than investing in education, gets more bang for the buck than addressing Indigenous disadvantage. So it's a good market for economists, because we can help any of you. But the actual fight that's being set up is a fight between people who should actually agree on something simple. Why don't we just scrap the stage 3 tax cuts and divvy up the 15 billion between us? Why don't we just scrap the fossil fuel subsidies and divvy it up between us? So by convincing, and it's a very good trick, taken decades, run by clever people, don't underestimate them. But having convinced some of the richest people in the world, not you, but everyone else in this room, and you are, highest income city in one of the highest income countries in the world, by convincing the richest people in the world that we're broke, that's how you constrain everybody's ambitions. You make them, in the lead up to an election, you make the nurses union fight against the teachers union to see who, to spend their members' money on what the priority should be, when both should be funded.
Is the penny starting to drop from aged care to seeing that, like, people won't work in aged care because you're not paid, to what's happening at the airports at the moment, where, the airlines have cut staff, they've got them on, dodgy contracts, whatever, and Alan Joyce is blaming us, the traveller, because we're not used to it anymore.
Yeah.
There's no staff out there.
Yeah.
And they're not well paid.
No.
Is the penny starting to drop?
Look, I hope so, but it's interesting to remember that it was the coalition that kicked the Royal Commission into aged care off, and that's good, tick, well done them. But I don't think they understood I don't know why they did it, frankly. Like, I'm glad they did
They were
it.
forced by an ABC reporter, I think, weren't they?
Well, they were under pressure.
Finally.
But I don't know why they did it, because if you think about it, it's catastrophic for them. And that's precisely why Labor have made it the centrepiece of their budget and reply speech, because it's catastrophic for them. So let's just think about the political strategy of what happened. When there's enormous queues at Sydney Airport, Alan Joyce blames the people queuing. That is neoliberalism in a nutshell. No, we victim blame. Victim blaming is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is victim blaming. Someone's poor, mustn't have worked hard. Don't have a house, that's your fault. You know, you name it. Everything is victim blaming in neoliberalism. Guess who the one group you can't blame in Australia is? Old people in aged care homes. Just can't be done. And guess who votes Liberal in very large numbers? Old people. No, it's true. I don't know why they did the Royal Commission. Because it was only ever going to say, this thing's a shit show. It was only ever going to say, you need to regulate it and you need to spend more money on it. And now, of course, they haven't.
They did make Richard Colbeck minister. He was good at recalling numbers.
Well, I was going to say, the guy that didn't have any idea how many people died in aged care on his watch. But so seriously, I think aged care is fascinating. And you say, has the penny dropped? I think no, but boy, is that the wrong industry to try and do neoliberalism wedge politics on. Because you can't blame the victim. So here we are just stuck with this horrible reality and a government that actually isn't going to fix it.
And this gives me hope that we might be finally getting it. Now, I'll just ask one last question here and then you're able to come to the microphone to ask Richard your own questions because you're still optimistic at the end, after whacking us around and with truths and facts and, you know, really incredible examples. You say we have to find a way to draw the public back into these decisions and discussions. How do we do it? Look, they turn up tonight.
Well, why am I an optimist? Because I do think we can drag people back into these. But again, you know, I said this to a group of people at the Institute yesterday. Like, everyone thinks they're cynical about politicians, but in my experience, people aren't ever cynical enough. These are smart, hard-working people who, if they're in government, have won an election, which is hard to do. So never, ever underestimate them. So if you, for whatever reason, were born or made to feel like giving tax cuts to high-income earners was far more important than helping people in aged care strapped to chairs, and I mean that's their priority. If you were of that ilk and you just wanted more of that, you wanted less taxes and less government services for people, then you have to make people lose faith in public services. Right? You have to actually erode people's faith in the services. You have to erode people's faith in the decision-making process so that people think, it doesn't really matter who I vote for, they're all the same. Whenever you hear someone say all politicians are the same, you just heard someone who's not going to shift their vote when they see a problem. So unfortunately, eroding people's faith in the role of the state, eroding people's faith in the role of government, indeed making it normalised that pork barrel politics is fine and corruption is endemic, is actually not a bad thing for those people who want to cut taxes and spend less on your services. Because if people are so dissatisfied that they tune out, that's perfect. Right? It's actually great for young people. It's great for conservative politicians that young people think it's all hopeless. It doesn't matter who they vote for. Because guess what? It's a lot easier to shovel money onto rich old people and slug them higher for hex if the young people think it doesn't matter who they vote for. So unfortunately, sowing the seeds of cynicism and sowing the seeds of scepticism about the role of the state is the neoliberal strategy for getting away with it. Democracy thrives on high expectations. And unless we think, God, these people have done a crap job, we need someone better, the minute you hear yourself or other people saying, well, they're all the same, then why not be bad at it? So let me just end with an analogy. Imagine that I wanted to be the president of the local surf club or the president of some local community organisation. And my election pitch for the job was to tell everybody that surf clubs are crap, who needs surf clubs, and if you vote for me for president, I'll gradually shut the whole thing down. Wouldn't usually get you elected to run the surf club. But how do you become Prime Minister in Australia? Well, government's crap. Who needs government? And if you vote for me, I'll do a lot less of it. Right? No, but not
Use
you.
the dentist analogy.
Or link it to a dentist. But a majority of Australians have voted for that. That's the brutal truth of it. So why am I an optimist? Because most countries in the world aren't as crap as that. And we are one of the richest countries in the world, and the only thing stopping us from scrapping tax cuts, taxing the mining industry, abolishing subsidies to fossil fuels, and spending enormous amounts of money that would create enormous amounts of jobs and boost the quality of people's lives and lower the cost of living on everything from health and education. The only thing stopping us from doing that is voting for someone promising to do it. And Europe is full of examples of people who did, and our own history is full of us doing it. So to suggest that we can't do it, that's what bugs me. But if we're choosing to do it, at least admit it's a choice. But the power of economics has been to tell people there is no choice. We have to cut wages, we have to cut taxes, we have to have a smaller public sector. And by telling everybody that there is no choice, that's what's helped get people to tune out of politics. And that's the real win.
Okay, who's coming up for a question? Just come up to the microphone. I can keep chatting away here.
I've scared them all off, Alex.
But you're probably going, why doesn't she ask this?
Here comes a brave one.
Here comes a brave. Thank you so much.
Great discussion, guys. Thank you so much for this. I'm not sure if it's making me feel better on a Wednesday night, but
We'll lift you up at the end.
can we, the people, shift the narrative? Can we take control of what our politicians are telling us? Can we break this disciplinary silo of a conflict between funding for health and funding for education and funding for aged care? Can we as a society make a value statement that maybe what we care about is actually caring? I'm drawing on some work that's been done from Australia Remade, looking at what the public good is and encouraging and fostering that discussion about what actually matters for us in our lives, how we can live a life which has value, which has meaning, which gives people dignity and respect. How much control can we take of that narrative?
Yeah, great question. So can people take control and change it? Let me flip that. The only people who can are you. Like, this is actually, sorry to sound patronising, that's democracy, that's it. There's no them in it. Like, if Australian voters don't care, or Australian voters are happy with how things are, it will stay the way it is. Literally the only group in Australia who can change it are a whole bunch of citizens who care, which is why I say democracy thrives on high expectations. We can afford to do anything we want, but we can't afford to do everything we want. And, you know, let's be optimistic. I mean, 10 years ago, there was no appetite at all in federal parliament for a federal corruption watchdog. None. Right? Both major parties opposed it, the media opposed it, everyone thought it was a crap idea. Believe it or not, now everyone agrees we need one, including Scott Morrison, who just having agreed to do it.
In the budget papers, zero.
Yeah, but it's listed in the budget papers.
It is listed, but there's zero money for it. Yeah.
But it's only in the budget papers because Treasury know he promised to do it. Right? And they're like, well, promised to do it. Okay, how much money are you seeking to appropriate for that? Zero. Right? But it is actually coalition policy to have a federal corruption watchdog. How did that happen? It came by people demanding it. So can people change things? Of course. Will people change things? You bet. Will they change them in the way you like? No idea. Right? It's a just catastrophic error to think that things can't change. They can. The democratic fight is a changeover in which direction? Now, of course we can do it different or better. And think about all the excuses that get wheeled out. Oh, the media's terrible. Yes, I remember the good old days when Kerry Packer owned Channel 9. What the people's champion he was. Right? So, no, but we shouldn't hark back to some period where wealth and power and media magnates were on the progressive side of politics. Like, that's bizarre. Or Twitter ruined everything. Oh, Twitter. Well, New Zealand's got Twitter. Am I allowed to say Scandinavia has Twitter? Right? So we get all exceptionalist about Australia. Well, there's other countries doing it. And if they can, we can. So there's my main source of optimism.
I have a question about this election. I mean, we've got we're up to the second generation of the sort of grassroots, Cathy McGowan, we've got Helen Haynes, and we've got a number of independents, particularly strong women. What difference do you think that can make to have that coterie of independents?
Oh, enormous difference. Thank you for the question, and there's something else to be very optimistic about. But I'll disagree with you slightly. I don't think it's the second generation at all. Australia has a long, proud history of independents and minor parties in our parliament, but the media have always wiped them out of the narrative. You know, I'm thinking back to, you know, your Tony Windsors and your Peter Andrens.
Peter Andren, yeah.
Right, exactly. And these were important people who delivered important things, and not just at a federal level, at a state level. And of course, here in the Territory, we've been burdened with hung parliament for how long now? 15 years?
It's been a disaster.
Oh, it's horrible, isn't it? No, but see, we don't even talk about it that
No.
way. So we've kind of just completely obscured the very important role that independents and minor parties have played in both houses of parliament and all of our governments for years. Because in my experience, and I mean directly working in parliament and externally trying to change parliamentarians' minds, the biggest, best funded lobbyists in the country hate crossbenchers. They hate crossbenchers. They hate the existence of crossbenchers. The media hate crossbenchers because they make everything less predictable. This is why I love crossbenchers. And I mean this quite literally. Like, imagine that you are the Minerals Council or BHP or Commonwealth Bank or National Australia Bank, and imagine that you make billions of dollars a year in profit. And imagine that government regulation is one of the main ways that you make billions of dollars in profit. And imagine, because it's your job to maximise the profits of your firm, you think investing in influencing regulation would be one of the main things your enormously profitable company would do. Imagine that, contrary to everything people say, you thought long term and didn't just think who's the current treasurer and didn't just think who's the opposition treasury spokesperson. What if you actually thought, who are the up-and-comers in Labor and Liberal? Who are the people that might be treasurer or prime minister in 10 or 20 years' time? What if we made friends with them as soon as they entered parliament? What if we were just nice to them and took them on trips and showered them with support for a decade or two before they became a minister, so that the day that they were in charge of regulating us, we'd be the first to send them a nice present? And then imagine some bloody crossbenchers in balance of power and says no. So, you know, it's incredibly disruptive having these kind of, and I don't mean this as a pejorative, I mean it literally, having these random people pop in at the most powerful levels in our decision-making process, because they can't anticipate who they're going to be years and decades in advance. And they just have to deal with them as, you know, power to power, you know, starting from scratch. And they hate it. So big picture, you know, it's no accident that everybody in business likes majority governments.
They hate them, threaten them to send them to police with Jackie Lambie recently. I mean,
you name it.
Yeah.
You know, and look, don't get me wrong, there's many things I disagree with Pauline Hanson about, but she went to jail for a minor breach of the Electoral Act. She went to jail. And Tony Abbott was proudly behind the pogrom raged against her. And she went to jail. And you think about what people have got away with in recent years. So minor parties and independents are an existential threat to people who want to be friends with powerful people, like the most powerful industries in the country. So that's the big picture. The small picture, the independents running this generation, which I think is exciting in all sorts of ways. What's really interesting from my point of view about it is that the Liberal Party and National Party, the so-called coalition, are so radically divergent in terms of the voters they're chasing. The things that they agree on are vanishingly small, except that they'd rather be in government than Labor be in power. And for a decade now, the coalition has kind of pandered to the Barnaby Joyces and the Matt Canavans, and have sort of desperately tried to hang on to, you know, the subsidies for coal are very popular amongst Barnaby and Matt Canavan, and they're toxic in...
the Dave Sharma and Trent Zimmerman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, and you know, I know plenty of people like this, there's a lot of people that just for whatever reason won't ever vote Labor. So if they won't ever vote Labor and there's a Liberal in town, then they'll just vote Liberal. So Dave Sharma, Trent Zimmerman, Jason Falinsky, Tim Wilson, all of these people just take for granted that they will be in Parliament for the next 20 years because the people that live near them will never vote Labor. And then as soon as they're offered a viable choice, a strong independent woman, for example, as you said, saying, well, yeah, look, you vote for me, you're not voting for Labor, but you'll get climate action, integrity commission, and I don't hate my gender, so I'll try and look after women better than the Liberals have. And enormous numbers of people are voting for them. Now that's interesting in a seat-by-seat case, but what's really interesting is how it's disrupted the whole macro politics. Because Scott Morrison's sitting there thinking, so am I allowed to just go out there and hug coal? No. So am I allowed to run out there and pretend to love renewables? No. So he can't say anything about a whole bunch of issues because what Dave Sharma needs him to say and what Barnaby Joyce demands he say means he ends up saying almost nothing. So yeah, the independents are doing something very significant, but don't ever think for a minute that this is a new idea. Like, don't get me wrong, it's higher profile than it's ever been, it's more interesting than it's ever been, but it's important to remember and remind people that independents have been making a positive contribution to our democracy since Federation.
Got a question here?
My next answer will be shorter.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Look, to me, one of the elephants in the room is the role of education. It seems to me that we're dealing with social sciences, the role of economics and social studies, and there was a time where citizenship education, political education, the histories and the broader social sciences played a huge role in informing children. It seems to me that with Pfizer levels declining, you only have to see the recent role of the federal government in getting rid of this and trying to not fund the social sciences for university students. I wonder whether the solution might be, or I'd be interested in your view, on what role social science education and critical thinking and analytical thinking for our children could play a role in perhaps addressing what Alex said, which was, how do we solve this problem?
Yeah. Look, it's a really important question. In general, I agree with you, but think again how conservatives have politicised the education curriculum. Like, it's not a mistake. Nothing they do is a mistake. You might not agree with it, but it's always done for a reason.
Humanities degrees went, 130%?
Well,
yeah.
Humanities degrees and arts degrees in particular, I think are really interesting. So conservatives spent 20 years saying everyone should study business or engineering or marketing or something useful because arts degrees are a waste of everybody's time, until they'd convinced everybody and made it very expensive and hard to do and slashed the funding. And then a few years ago, the Conservatives got all excited or scared and went, universities don't teach anything about Western civilization anymore. And we're not studying Western civilization anymore. It's like, you mean like in history or in philosophy or in an arts degree? No, but and then the Ramsay Centre came along and said, well, we're going to fund Western civilization studies. And the left took the bait and attacked it. When the smart thing would have been to say, you mean we need arts degrees? So, yeah, I absolutely think that the social sciences and the arts should be better taught, but we've really politicised our curriculum. Our curriculum has become incredibly neoliberal. I remember being a student saying, why do I have to learn this? It's boring learning some stuff at school. But no one actually listened to me. They just said, I don't know, to get whatever.
I always wonder how many career advisors advise people to go into the arts.
Well, exactly. I've kept my career advisor's advice. It's not pretty. So my short answer is yes, we should, but it's going to be really hard to do it. And let me just chuck an elbow at the Australian Electoral Commission on the way through. One of their jobs is to explain to people our electoral system. Put up your hand if you feel confident explaining preferential voting to one of your friends. Nerds. All right. Well, you all should. You all should. Because if we don't all understand preferential voting, we can't really participate actively in our democracy. preferential voting, I'm a big fan. Some people hate it. I love preferential voting. But I also think I understand it really well. And a lot of the reasons that people think preferences are somehow dodgy is because no one's ever explained to them properly, you know, what it is and how it works. So the Electoral Commission's statutory obligation is to educate the public about our electoral system, and it's desultory would be complimentary. I think disastrous. And don't forget we had to do a redo of the West Australian State Senate election, 6 years ago? It was catastrophically bad.
Are there any? Oh, yeah, I think. He was first. He's first, then you, and then we might draw a line under it. He.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Richard. After the GFC, a good Labor government, part led and was part pushed by a hysterical media and Abbott opposition obsessed with debt and deficits into pushing deficit reduction, even though the unemployment rate was well above the post-war average of 2%, and there was no counter-inflationary reason for fiscal tightening. Now, the usual so-called new Keynesian types of the kind of Larry Summers and many others, the kinds who deregulated Wall Street in the late 90s, whose ideas are not new and definitely not Keynesian, already calling for a federal Labor government, if one is elected post-May, to focus on deficit reduction rather than poverty alleviation, climate action, full employment and raising job seeker. How do we push back against that orthodox progressive line, and more importantly, how do we work together from the people pushing to expand the Overton window, like the modern monetary theorists and the ecological economists, to the old Keynesians working within the Overton window?
Well, what Lachlan just asked was, should we be worried about budget deficits? And should Labor be worried about budget deficits? And the crystal clear answer is no. No, they absolutely shouldn't. The last US president to deliver a budget surplus was a guy called Bill Clinton. The last budget surplus delivered in the US. The last UK Prime Minister to deliver a budget surplus was Tony Blair. Happened to be in the same year. I think it was 1991. And you know what the world thinks about budget deficits in the US and the UK? Nothing. No one cares. Australia is uniquely, insecurely obsessed with budget deficits and surpluses. And no, but exactly.
It's gone.
And this time, we've actually got this wonderful strategic silence between Labor and Liberals, right? Neither of them want to talk about the budget deficit because neither of them are going to deliver a budget surplus for the next 10 years. And they both know it. And no matter how brutal this election gets, I tell you, neither one of them will run to the poison well of budget surpluses because neither of them know they have a snowball's chance in hell of delivering one. So we have to kind of separate, again, the rhetoric from the reality. The reality is we're going to have budget deficits in Australia for at least the next 10 years. And if you don't want budget deficits in Australia for the next 10 years, there are two courses of action. Big tax increases, sign me up, I'll have them, or massive cuts in spending. Guess what neither party is going to commit to? Big tax cuts or massive cuts in spending. They are both terrified of, tax increases. It was a test, see if you're listening. That was not a gaffe. I'm not going to poke my tongue out. You cope, I apologise. So we live at a really interesting point in history, but a kind of really disappointing point in our democracy, because everyone in power now agrees that it was silly to worry about budget deficits. It's silly to worry about them now. Neither of them are going to deliver a budget surplus for the next 10 years, but we're not allowed to talk about it. And the whole point of my essay is that Peter Dutton wants to spend a lot more money on defence, and Anthony Albanese wants to spend a lot more money on aged care, and I'd like to spend a lot more money on climate change. And no matter who you are, everyone's got a problem that they know that only the government can solve. Until we all kind of agree that unless we just accept that having one of the lowest levels of tax in the developed world and being obsessed with budget deficits is a bad idea, until we admit that, we can't just have a genuine, open, honest public debate about what do you want more of and what do you want less of. What are your priorities? What are the things you want more money spent on? What are you willing to go without? Maybe a tax cut, maybe $100 billion worth of subs, maybe we could get rid of $10 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies. But until we can just have an open, honest, democratic debate about what we want more of and what we want less of, then people are going to remain bored and disengaged from democracy.
One last question, and then we'll... Oh, we got two last questions. Just okay. Is everyone okay? All right.
It's a corollary question, I think, to what you just said,
Mm.
which is, I probably used the wrong word, anyway, that word. When does national debt matter?
When someone in power wants to make a point. It's not economically significant. Japan's been running budget deficits for decades. It's one of the richest countries in the world, has enormous public debt. No one cares. No one cares about the size of the enormous US debt. The debt itself is not the problem. What matters is whether or not we are making decisions that increase our ability to produce stuff in the future, and I think this is the bit that everyone, including economists, including myself, probably for decades haven't put enough thought into, we have to spend money in ways that actually keep improving our ability to produce.
Education.
Obviously education, childcare, health, right? These have enormous long-term benefits if we do these things. But we also, and this is the bit that I think's been left out, we actually need to think about how much money we're spending and the way we're spending it to hold our democracy together. Because I don't mean to sound paranoid, I don't think our democracy is going to collapse in the next 10 years, but when 40% of people under 40 in America aren't convinced democracy is a good idea, we've got real problems. So yeah, when does debt become a problem? When the reason it's growing is unrelated to us investing in things that will help us make stuff and help us stay united as a community. So, you know, if we just keep racking up JobKeeper and handing money to Harvey Norman and we make the income inequality in Australia worse and worse and worse, I think bad things will happen to our society well before bad things happen to our economy.
And I think last question here.
But that was a really good question.
It
I
was.
have to think
It's a
harder
great
about it too.
A good answer.
Thanks, Richard. The Coalition of the Better Economic Managers, reality or
Sit
myth?
down, we agree, yep.
Yep.
Everyone knows that.
Reality or myth? I know your answer anyway, but how do you know? By what key metrics do you know that is a myth?
Yeah, well, so this is the last question. This is my last answer, so I won't rave on too long. The economy is a metaphor. It's not a thing. You can't go and find it. You can't go and touch it. So how do we know if the abstract thing that we can't touch is going well or not? And the bits of the economy that I touch and care about are different to the bits of the economy that you touch and care about, and entirely unrelated to the bits of the economy that Indigenous people living around Uluru touch and care about. So we have to be very careful about the whole idea of who's the best economic manager, because it actually accepts a really dangerous premise, and that we all benefit from the same things, and we don't. Because what's been happening in Australia for the last decade is the profit share of GDP has been rising and the wage share of GDP has been falling. So is that good or bad? I don't know. Do you work for a living or do you own a lot of shares? So we have to, don't get me wrong, I understand we can have metaphors like the society and the community and the economy. I'm not being banal, but we can't, if I said, I think we need to do this because it's good for society, you'd all think, really? Which bit of society? Well, every time you hear someone say something's good for the economy, you need to ask yourself the same question. As for the sort of the track record, well, it depends really in lots of ways. Which bits of the economy do you care about? If you care about wage growth, this government's a disaster. If you care about budget deficits, this government's a disaster. If you care about public debt, this government's a disaster. The unemployment rate's pretty low at the moment, which is great. Why is the unemployment rate low? Because of the enormous deficit. right? And this government, the great economic managers, delivered low unemployment by doing the thing they've raged against for 30 years. So it seems a bit odd to say, having said for 30 years pulling this lever is dumb, and then being forced to pull the lever, it's a bit odd to then take credit for the benefits that came with pulling the lever. So is unemployment low in Australia at the moment? Yes. Is that good? Yes. Why is it low? Because they did the thing they promised they'd never do. That doesn't really seem like good economic management to me. That sounds like under pressure they got forced to do something they thought was wrong, and it accidentally turned out to be right. So, yeah, I think it's very hard to answer the question, which government was the best economic manager, because I don't accept the premise there's one indicator of what's good for the economy. But if you judge this government by the targets it set for itself, it failed dismally. When Scott Morrison was Treasurer, he promised to double the rate of productivity growth. Anyone want to have a guess what happened? Fell. Right? This government was elected saying they'd fix the debt and deficit crisis. What happened? Went the other way. Every budget since they were elected said wages will pick up soon. Guess what? Haven't picked up soon. So, you know, how do I quantify who was good and who was bad? I don't know. But if you judge them by their own claims, they've failed to meet their own goals. Does that make them better or worse than John Gorton or Malcolm Fraser or Keating during the recession? I don't know. But they haven't delivered any of the things they said they'd deliver. I'll shut up.
No, it's like any time spent with you, Richard, is fantastic. And I really want to thank you for, you deliver us hard messages, but there is an optimism there, and there is an incredible work ethic, and there is an incredible push to make this a better country. And around us, I really want to thank the staff from the Australia Institute who are here tonight. And I get to see them occasionally, and they are the most fantastic, hardworking, incredibly smart people I've ever had the pleasure to work with. So if you want to support the Australia Institute, please go to the website and please donate when you can. They are doing such fantastic work. Thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. You can make a difference. You can change things. Please, keep pushing. Buy lots of Richard's books. Hand them out.
I'll be signing them up the back.
He'll sign them up the back. And as I said, don't take wine to the next dinner party. Take a book, or take Alan Beam's book. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. We really appreciate it. And thanks to Richard Dennis.
Alex.